created back in 2017. It was created by the RTA Technical Management Committee based on concerns about cost estimates that were being discussed before the TMC. The task force was charged with confirming scopes, making sure that they adhered to the RTA plan and that they were consistent with the rules of the RTA administrative code, and to confirm that cost estimates were in fact reasonable. Projects that were expected to go to bid in the short term, basically the 2-year period, were the projects that were prioritized. And the task force held multiple meetings. They invited the project team that was developing the projects, along with their with the jurisdiction that was leading the effort. They reviewed scopes. They reviewed plans, went through the plans and specifications that were available, and reviewed what was available to them in the way of value engineering reports and so forth. And what they did was they produced a series of reports that were then presented to the Technical Management Committee as a whole. The TMC reviewed 6 projects. They had determined that additional projects would be reviewed once final design and cost estimates were prepared. However, because of the pandemic, they were put on hold. But there are 4 of the 6 projects that they reviewed that are now completed. The projects that remain are currently under construction, and those 2 projects are Downtown Links and Broadway Boulevard from Euclid to Country Club. And with that, we've enclosed the reports that were produced in your packets, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about those reports. So, Madam Chair, if anybody has any questions about what was presented there.
Okay. Hearing no questions, we'll move on to item 3.
Okay, moving on. We are going to be reviewing RTA funding requirements. This is a presentation that was actually given by the RTA's attorney to the RTA board at their meeting this month, earlier in the month. And I'll review what the RTA attorney presented. I also have attached within your packets a memorandum as well. The RTA administrative code limits reimbursable items for regionally funded projects to a number of key categories. They are looking at costs associated with planning, design, right-of-way acquisition, and costs associated with relocation, construction, and any of the reports that are needed to support those, such as design concept reports, bridge selection reports, etc. Safety, intersection improvements, bicycle and pedestrian improvements are also authorized in accordance with selection criteria and corridor priorities established by the board. The code provides for small business assistance, and that is a named sub-element within the RTA plan. And projects or components thereof that are directly related to transportation capacity and safety improvements, including intelligent transportation systems, traffic control devices, work zone and traffic management, and street lighting. Transit stops and pullouts, as well as queue jumper lanes, for example, for express buses, are authorized. Bicycle and pedestrian facilities where they're integral to the roadway, including sidewalks separated from curbs, and multi-use paths are authorized. Utility relocations where required by law or prior rights. And this is something that the Technical Management Committee discussed extensively. They refined the policy over a course of a number of meetings. Really what's at issue here is just making sure that if a utility is in the right of way, at the sufferance of the local government, that they're obligated to relocate those utilities at their own costs. Whereas if a utility acquires its own right-of-way, and then the local government subsequently acquires overlapping right-of-way over the top of it for purposes of building a road, then the utility has a prior right, and it's up to the RTA or the agency to relocate it at their expense. So in those situations, those kinds of costs the RTA will incur and reimburse. Drainage improvements, limited to those required for the roadway project and which do not exceed local jurisdictional practices. It's not the RTA's job to solve a regional flooding problem or even a serious local problem, but we do have to do that which is customary in association with a roadway project. We can't exacerbate a condition, certainly, and we build, where there are storm drains proposed, we build the storm drains, but we don't necessarily solve a regional problem.
Excuse me, Jim, just quick clarification on that, just to make sure I'm thinking right too. So let's say there's water harvesting features. So when this was originally done, would that fall under that?
Water harvesting, I think, would be covered. It'd be incidental, and it would be customary to a road project, particularly, and in fact, it's actually beneficial in the sense that it reduces the size of the storm drain that one would ordinarily put in. So, I would characterize that as being something that would be covered, and it may also be covered under the landscaping component as well. So,
Thank you.
Speaking of landscaping, landscaped medians and shoulders and other roadway improvements within reasonable limits are also authorized for reimbursement. However, we did find early on that there were some challenges with some of the projects going well above and beyond. So what we did was, again, with the RTA Technical Management Committee, we have a policy subcommittee. They brought forth some policy recommendations that were subsequently acted upon by the RTA board, which set a standard of 4% of the total construction cost was the maximum that we would consider for landscaping. The RTA board or the policy allows for paying for access management, consolidating driveways, things like that, things that will help with the proper traffic flow. Obviously, one of the key things that we have to cover the cost of is paving, whether it's asphalt or concrete paving. We included specifically asphalt rubber because at the beginning of the RTA, there was some discussion about whether or not that was a premium product that we should pay for, and there are benefits for doing it. So asphalt rubber is specifically authorized. We will cover the costs of staff time directly attributable to a project as defined in the project's intergovernmental agreement. We're not interested in reimbursing the costs of the administration of a Department of Transportation, but those people that are specifically assigned to a project that have billable hours attributable to it, those staff we will reimburse. Again, this was refined as a result of running into some requests that we felt we needed to deny. Noise walls. This is something that the CART actually had a lot of conversation about early on. Noise walls that were necessary to meet applicable local, state, and federal standards. There are different standards, and noise is something that is very impactful on a local community. And if it is a federalized project, we will go to the federal standard. If it is a local project, we will use a different standard, particularly if there's the ability to deaden some of the sound with asphalt rubber. And that's one of the key benefits of asphalt rubber is the noise deadening properties of an open mix of asphalt. Required environmental and cultural resources mitigation is clearly authorized. ART, not to exceed 1% of construction costs. That is specifically put in there. There is sometimes a desire to do more art, and maybe it's appropriate, but that's what our expenditure rules cap it at. Public outreach expenses are authorized, provided they're reasonable and do not include unnecessary food or promotional items. That's something that we want to make sure that the resources are going into the road. And critical wildlife linkages and trails. There is also a critical transportation related wildlife linkages component to the RTA plan, as well as environmental and economic vitality plan. So that's explicitly approved. Oh. Okay, now it's moving again. Some costs have been disallowed where optional items have been added beyond the scope of the project, where funding caps have been exceeded, utility relocation expenses that are not due to prior rights, project elements that are not that are the responsibility of another entity, and reimbursements will not be made for redesign due to a change in project scope or design concept. And that's something that there was a lot of discussion about at the RTA technical management in the early years of the plan. Additional costs due to modifications of the scope of projects are acceptable if those modifications do not diminish the functionality of a project and the project lead agency provides the funds for the added element. So we have no problem with people going above and beyond as long as they bring their checkbook with it. Now, there are some mandates in the RTA plan. One is that the plan may not be amended to add or delete an element or substantially change an element without the prior approval of the electorate. We can't willy-nilly add a new project to the project list. The prior plan approval of the electorate is waived if a political subdivision causing changes within its jurisdiction to the regional transportation plan incurs the incremental costs of implementing those proposed changes. And it goes to that augmentation of project scopes if they're desired. I know we've had instances where, I'll give you an example, Camino de Mañana was scoped as a 2 and 3 lane roadway. The town of Marana opted to build it out to a 4-lane divided. They paid for the incremental cost and they built the wider road project. On completion of construction, the municipality in which the RTA monies are spent for a project is responsible for maintaining the project that's built. So that's clearly key. Once we complete the project, it's on the local government's books, and it's their responsibility to maintain it from that point forward. And with that, that's a high-level overview of some key portions of the RTA administrative code, and would be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Madam Chair, if I may just add a couple of comments. So as Jim mentioned, our attorney provided this update at the last RTA board meeting. As you all recall, back in 2017, we had the state mandated audit. And again, thanks to the CART committee and the board, the audit that was performed last time for the 10-year was very successful, very positive outcome. So we appreciate that. And we're currently under the 15-year audit process. So as a result, board members as well as our attorney really felt it was critical to have a reminder for everyone, for all committees, to really understand what the rules are and why, in some cases, we're not able to provide funding for projects. And as Jim mentioned nicely, we get a lot of requests that in some cases we have to say no because they're not in compliance with our policies and the mandate. And with the remaining 5 years of the plan, obviously we're going to continue to have that conversation on what elements truly meet the intent of the RTA plan and are eligible for funding. So it was just a good reminder for everyone, and we want to make sure that at least at the subcommittee level, you have this information. And if you like, we can repeat this for the full CART committee as well. But hopefully it was a good refresher. Most of you have been on the committee long enough that hopefully remember some of these individual cases when we brought them to your attention. So it was mostly for a reminder and an update. So if you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer your questions.
I just wanted to make sure, just so that I'm not misunderstanding what you just said on that last slide, when you're talking about the RTA mandates, and the very last one was once we complete a project, that it's turned over in terms of maintenance to the jurisdiction which has the project. I know that there's been a lot of discussion about next RTA about putting road maintenance money in there. So I want to make sure I'm understanding exactly what you're saying. Is that a mandate in the existing law that would require a change of the law in order to do that? Or is there that flexibility?
I think it really depends on how you look at it. Based on the current legislation, RTA plan projects that are funded by the RTA, once completed, are not the responsibility of RTA for maintenance anymore. That's spelled out in the legislation.
Right.
So your follow-up question would be, is there flexibility to change that in the next plan? And I think we really have to wait and see how we address that. My personal belief in that would be, let's say you have a capital maintenance project that's in the plan, authorized and approved by the voters. Same thing could potentially apply. You go in and you do the first time of basically reconstruction of the road, but then after that, it becomes maintenance responsibility based on the current legislation.
So the reason I'm asking is just because I believe that this is going to be point of discussion.
Yeah.
So again, am I understanding? I'm asking, I think I know the answer, but it's in the statute right now.
Correct.
In order to change that, you'd have to change the statute, or is there wiggle room in the interpretation of that a new voter approved plan?
I think the latter. If it's in the plan, if it's approved by the voters, and if it's considered the capital maintenance,
Okay,
we
that's what I wanted to
believe
clarify.
that is eligible as a transportation improvement element.
Okay.
Now, the follow-up question is, what happens after 5 years, 10 years? Can RTA go back and continue to do pavement management? The answer to that one would be most likely not, based on the current legislation.
And I'd add, I think this was really targeted on making sure that it's clear that there's a handoff on responsibility. The street sweeping, the maintenance, the striping, the work on maintaining all of the lighting and everything. All of that resides with the jurisdiction once it's been turned over.
The project would have to, when the cost estimates would come out, they'd have to include if they did include the maintenance, you'd have to, what they call that, life cycle costs or something like that of the roadway.
Yeah, I think what we need to look at is how we scope a project and what it is that we are proposing and presenting to the voters that we're going to build. Once we achieve that, at that point in time, it's turned over to the local government for maintenance from that point forward. We do have operations that we do that were specifically called out. They're transit related, but there is the potential to put in some of that, but we need to spell it out to the public.
And then that would be like a pavement management element or something like that, as far as roads, if that were potentially put into the next measure.
I'll take a whack at it, and my boss will correct me. But I think you need to spell out very specifically what it is that you're proposing, and once it's complete, it transitions over to the local government. I don't see it as an ongoing maintenance district.
And I think Mr. Huffman really put the focus on where it needs to be on that conversation. Is it considered a one-time capital investment, or is it an ongoing pavement management? If it's ongoing pavement management based on the current legislation, that's not really our understanding of what that fund can be used for. But if it's a one-time capital investment, it could be just a mill and replace, our definition is that's a one-time capital maintenance. That's eligible, but then after that, then it's not, then you turn it over to the jurisdiction that owns the facility.
There's just been so much out there from the public about maintaining what we build things, and then we don't have the money to maintain them. I just want to have a clear understanding of that, because I hear that a lot from
So,
people.
and you're right, we hear it as well. So the intent of the current RTA plan was that one-time capital investment to improve those facilities and not be responsible for the ongoing maintenance. That was the intent of the original plan and the legislation.
So just to keep beating a dead horse here, but what I keep hearing is statutorily, the RTA cannot be responsible for just ongoing maintenance, but if there's a plan approved by the voters that has one-time capital expenses approved by the voters, there's that narrower window of what a lay person might consider.
That's
road
that's our
maintenance.
understanding currently. And again, if you look at it from the perspective of the purpose of having a plan in front of the voters is to have the voters truly understand what that fund is going to be used for and then endorse the expenditure.
Right.
So from a legal perspective, as long as it's spelled out, it's in the plan, we believe that that is meeting the intent of the legislature.
Sure.
Just to add on to it, not to add further confusion, but I think it's great clarification. But currently, there's nothing in the plan for a mill and fill type of situation. or
Correct.
maintenance. I just, okay.
The 2006 plan,
Right.
and again, going through the whole plan development process, meeting with all of our stakeholders and jurisdictional members. At that time, if you recall, maintenance was not a high priority. And as a result, the final plan that went to the voters did not include any paper management or any routine maintenance items.
Just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Okay. Well,
Move forward.
move forward. Okay, well, Madam Chair, our next discussion point is going to be on the notice of funding availability. There we go. Move too far. There we go. Got it. We issued a notice of funding availability on July 9th, advising our member jurisdictions of funding that's available. It was in our RTA budget and in the Transportation Improvement Program for use to augment funds on construction projects in fiscal years 22 and 23. Supplemental funding available for the projects is to be made available for projects that are expected to cost more than the RTA 2006 plan estimate was, ballot amount, if you will, or that are for projects that could be accelerated from what is currently in the fiscal year 22 to 26 Transportation Improvement Program, or both. Basically, if a project is desired to be accelerated and can be accelerated. So that's one of the big challenges. These projects do take an awful long time to develop. If project's in the pipeline ready to go and we can fund it, then that's what we're trying to accomplish with these 3 points. The RTA did develop a 22 to 26 fiscal years 22 to 26 transportation improvement program that funds all of the projects to the ballot amounts or the amount that's necessary to complete the project. And conservatively, the RTA budget, the original budget for fiscal year 22, allows for nearly $30 million of funding for additional project needs. The RTA board's approval and IGA amendments will be required to augment project funding beyond the amount that's identified in the RTA plan. But this will be the first time we'll be going beyond the plan amount. And that's really what is key here.
Was that from additional sales tax revenues that the RTA received, that additional 29 million?
It's not from additional sales taxes. It's, we have been very cautious in releasing funds to go out to construction, matching up our funding that's available to the promises that we made in the RTA plan. We've also brought additional sources of funds to bear on delivery of the RTA plan. These funds are above and beyond the minimum necessary to meet those ballot amounts, if you will.
If I may
And,
add,
matching-
to
yeah.
that as well. So if you recall, last fall, we discussed this with the full CART committee, and then later in the winter time. Our goal has always been to be able to meet the committed ballot amount on every project. So last fall and winter, and then at the May meeting, we were able to finalize the 5-year plan, and that's where Jim was mentioning that we utilized some non-RTA regional funds that were committed by the RTA board and the regional council to meet what was promised based on the ballot amounts. So thanks to you all, and again, we had a discussion with the CART committee, and you all endorsed the 5-year plan. So we met that commitment, but we all still recognize that some of these projects may need additional funding. So the purpose of this, identifying any additional funds that we can bring to bear, was to start looking at projects that are in the pipeline, and how do we start looking at each project on a case-by-case basis, on annual basis, hopefully with some real numbers, both on the cost estimating side as well as on the revenue side. So when we talk about $30 million, those are real dollars. We know that we have those dollars for revenue. And then hopefully the cost estimates are real dollars as well. So for planning purposes, when you lay it out for 5 years, you're talking about planning budget. But now we're down to annual budgets. And so the $30 million those are real dollars that we know we can commit.
Thank you.
Well, and in response to that request or notice of funding availability, the RTA did receive 4 funding requests totaling $47.6 million. 2 of those projects are currently under construction, and both of those have already been reviewed by the Technical Management Project Review Task Force. Remaining projects will be reviewed by the TMC Review Force, Project Review for Task Force as they near construction. Additionally, non-RTA regional funds are also committed to the RTA plan delivery. Funding awarded through the PAG process will reduce the amount necessary for the RTA to meet project funding needs. Approximately $7 million of federal funding is also available at this time, and it's going through a separate process and has already been heard by both the Transportation Improvement Program Subcommittee and the the Transportation Planning Committee. So those are going to be moving forward with recommendations as well. And so this is what staff is recommending, and that is that we request the subcommittee's recommendation for supplemental funding amounts to be identified by the RTA board for all 4 of the submitted projects, using RTA and other regional funds to cover cost overruns that are eligible for RTA project dollars.
And if you don't mind, just to go back and make sure we're clear on what we're talking about. So with the previous slide, we're talking about revenue.
Right.
We know we have $30 million of revenue that can help supplement these projects. With the next slide, we have $47 million worth of requests. We think we can close that gap with the $7 million of federal funds. So we're down to roughly $40 million worth of needs. And the difference is roughly $10 million. So we are hoping and we're confident that as we start looking through the individual projects and look at the details of what's eligible, what's not eligible, what are some of the additional entities that might be responsible to cover the cost of those additional costs, that we may be able to close that 10 million gap even more and be able to satisfy all 4 projects. So that's the reason for continuing the conversation, and making sure that all 4 projects are still in the conversation, and we're able to hopefully reach a point by adjusting, increasing the revenue a little bit with whatever funds we find, and reducing the expenditure a little bit where we can justify reducing the expenditure, and then find that hopefully exact sweet spot to make a recommendation to the board to go ahead and enter into an IGA amendment and make sure all these 4 projects can move forward.
So Farhad, can you tell me what is the process for so we've got a $10 million gap. So what's the process that we need to go through to identify what's not eligible? And then there's potentially maybe other monies out there that are there any other moving parts besides?
So the biggest moving part is really making sure the cost estimates are as fine-tuned as possible, and making sure that, and the utilities were a good example. If there's a $1 million utility relocation included in this $47 million, we need to sit down and say, oh, this one is not eligible for RTA. So now you're reducing that by $1 million. So we really need to go through that next step, that exercise with individual project sponsors, and make sure that that number is the correct number to target for.
So are you asking us today to authorize starting that process?
We started by asking the question. I don't think we have all the details yet, and obviously we're going to continue to ask for the details. But that's important for this committee to know. Obviously, for the board ultimately to make a recommendation, they need to have that additional breakdown on what's eligible, what's not eligible.
So I'm really just asking, what do you need from us today?
I think that would be really helpful for everyone to understand. Are we looking at eligible expenses, and can we break that out?
I mean, that makes sense. I'm sorry.
Have all these projects gone through thorough value engineering studies, or has that not been done yet?
So Jim can touch on that a little bit more, but if you recall the previous item, 2 of the projects have gone through additional review. The other 2 have not yet, but obviously they will as we move forward. But as far as value engineering is something that happened a few years ago. So
Yeah, I'd
if
be
you want
happy to
give an
answer
update on
that,
those.
Madam Chair. The Downtown Links project did go through a very thorough value analysis process. And it has also gone through additional, if you'll recall, there was a bid issued a number of years ago. The bid, they were not able to award it because it was over the amount that was available. So they went further, the next step, to doing additional value analysis and looking at how they could bring additional sources of funds to bear, which they've done both. We've seen some reductions in costs, and we've seen some additional funds coming into the project. So these are ways that the local government went about trying to narrow that gap. There's still a gap, and we're being asked to fund that. We also, and that project is under construction right now through the construction manager at risk process. There's also Broadway Boulevard, which while it didn't go through a value analysis process, it was very thoroughly discussed by the board, and it did go through the project task force process with the RTA Technical Management Committee. So both of those projects have been fairly well vetted and looked at by multiple entities to confirm that it's the scope is what we want to build it. The other 2 projects are, and I believe Tangerine Road also had a value analysis a number of years ago. That's one of the projects that there's a request to both accelerate funding and augment funding. And then there's Sunset Road, which Sunset's one that we haven't spent a whole lot of time looking at. We know that there is a change of scope. Some of it was really kind of a force majeure situation. We cannot build what was originally scoped on the ballot. the Arizona Corporation Commission and would not approve a railroad crossing that grade today. We thought we could do it back 15 years ago. That's no longer feasible. And so we would need to do a grade separation. And so there's an additional cost associated with that, but there's also a wider road that's being proposed than what was scoped and developed. So we need to go through that and look at what portion of it the RTA should be paying for. And that's a process that we need to talk through with the committees.
And just to add to that, so through the IGA process, obviously it's spelled out who's responsible for what, and we've been able to, again, fortunately, at least in one example, Flood Control District was very open to working with us and close some of that gap because they recognized that was beyond the roadway improvements. So those are the kind of opportunities we need to continue to look for. You know, who else is able to fund what portion of the project, and if they are eligible for RTA funding, then we want to move those elements forward. So I think we're in a really good place. I feel very comfortable that our goal is to complete all these projects. Obviously, that is the ultimate goal. But how do we get there and continue the conversation with you all and the board to make sure that we can deliver those projects? Interesting enough, you know, this is fiscal year 22 and 23, and I think we're in a good shape if we're looking at 2 fiscal years and we're only trying to close a 10 million gap. That's a good place to be, and we hope that we can close that gap.
So am I oversimplifying this to say that we have identified $37 million between the 30 million that you have and the 7 million in federal funds? And if we can coordinate with these jurisdictions to close that $10 million gap, we can move forward with all 4 of these projects?
Yep. Yeah, that's where we're at, and that's our goal, and that's what we hope that we can accomplish. Hopefully within the next couple of months, we'll be able to get to the point that at least the 2 projects that are under construction, we can proceed, and then the other 2 projects that are not yet in construction, hopefully would be in a place that we know we can continue to commit to those projects as well.
So Madam Chair, what do you need us to do today?
Well, Jim, for right now, has the TMC recommended that we move forward with our immediate need of providing the city of Tucson with the requested amounts?
The TMC has not yet discussed this. We are proposing to have a CART meeting and a TMC meeting, both early in September. So these will be topics of conversation.
And the actual amounts, I think that's something that would be really up to the board to fine tune and hopefully strike a really good, comfortable place. So we're not looking for the amount. We're looking for, is everybody in agreement that these projects are meeting intent, consistent with scope, and as a committee that we need to continue to work towards closing that gap.
And so for, as you mentioned earlier, the TMC already did that for the 2 City of Tucson projects.
The 2
correct?
project reviews, yes, those 2 went to the TMC, and again, even from staff perspective, from TMC perspective, all 4 projects are consistent with our intent. We know we have a few challenges on some of the scope items and eligibility for RTA funding, but all 4 projects should move forward, and we should all try to close that gap.
Have there been any bids done for, say, Tangerine Road? We know it's not under construction yet, but we have the ballot number and an estimate of, do we know those cost estimates are still valid today?
We haven't gotten any recent cost estimates. We are going to be working to give some ranges of costs for the completion of the RTA plan, and we'll be bringing that forward over the course of the next months.
And Tangerine, if you recall, that was a CM at risk project for 1 phase of Tangerine. This is the next phase, and most likely there'll be a follow-up phase as well. So for this next phase, they're looking at additional $12 million, actually.
That's my understanding. And they have obtained additional sources of funding to augment what we're bringing to the table.
So do you need us to make a recommendation that these 4 projects are consistent with the voter approved plan and to move forward with the CART and what do you need us to do?
Yeah, so I think again, it's recognizing that our goal is to complete those projects, but recognizing that closing the 10 million gap requires a little bit more information, the breakdown of the information, eligibility requirements, and really identifying if there are any scope changes, justify the reasoning for the scope change, and then hopefully be able to have good backup information for the board to make that decision at a later time.
So we're recommending today to continue that process, but that these, do you need us to say these
And
4?
obtain the additional information to be able to hopefully be able to make a recommendation at that time once you have all the
But
information.
is it important us to include in the recommendation that these 4 projects are consistent with the scope, or are we already past that?
That's staff recommendation. I think it's up to you if you want to get more information to make that determination. That's up to you. Again, we're not saying they're inconsistent. We're saying there are elements that may need more additional information and justification.
And Madam Chair, one thing I would add that bears note is that this is the first time that we're recommending that we fund beyond the ballot amount. That I think is something that if we make a motion, that's something that.
Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up too, because I had a board member ask, obviously up to now, everything was spelled out on the ballot. That was the target. We went through the process to hit that target. But this is really a new kind of a request for supplemental funding beyond that target. That's why we really need to make sure that we cross the T's, dot the I's before we make a recommendation to the RTA board.
So between now and the TMC meeting, which is on September 7th or 8th?
8th, I believe.
September 8th. Are they evaluating the other 2 projects or are?
Not currently. Again, if you recall, and Jim touched on that, their goal really was to go through the project review for projects that were ready to go to construction.
Right.
So
Okay.
they'll be doing that hopefully within the next 6 to 12 months,
Okay.
especially with Sunset. There appears to
Yes.
be a timeline because it's being combined with the I-10 project. And so that one ideally should be under construction within the next 12 to 18 months. So that's urgent. And I believe Tangerine also, they're hoping to go under construction within the next 12 to 18 months as well. So both those projects are in a kind of a latter part of the fiscal year.
Okay.
But the other 2 are under construction currently.
Correct. So that process will not hold up allocating funds to the 2 projects under construction so that they can continue moving forward. I guess
Yeah.
that's my concern.
Our goal is to get to a point that all 4 projects are receiving supplemental funding. But at what level, yet to be determined.
Okay.
Madam Chair, could I ask one, just for my own peace of mind, so that I make sure that we're not establishing some new precedent that we regret down the road? Because I can see if this is truly new ground, that we're for the first time exceeding what was in terms of cost, what was in the package. If we do this, what's to stop the next plan and for the next 30 years? Every time there's a project comes up, we start saying, well, you already let us exceed it on these 4. So are we establishing a new precedent, or are there legitimate reasons why this is coming up for the first time?
That's a really good question. And I think that's why we want to have all the details for the board to be able to make that decision. That's a really good question. What would you need to see to make sure that the additional cost is justified before the board can take that action?
In the original plan, wasn't there, from what I can remember, there was language in there that would allow for increases based on material escalation, et cetera, and
Yeah.
inflation.
Yeah, so the board has that authority, but going back to Mr. Huffman's question, how do you establish a criteria for what's eligible to go beyond and what's not? So a really good question, and that's, I think, a valid question to ask, to have that information for the board before they make a decision.
I mean, I could understand over a 20-year lifetime that there's going to be some discrepancies in those numbers. It just seems like we should have the right answer that says, well, in these 4 projects, here's the reason. And that was more of a one-off than it's a new tradition of we're going to pass a plan and then every project's going to exceed the number because we did it with these 4. That's all I don't want to end up with.
Madam Chair, I remember going back to what you said, that the board had leeway of increasing the cost. Was there a certain percentage? Was it 5% or 10% of a certain project that could be funded? It's vague. It was a number of years ago that I know that we talked about it.
Madam Chair, there's not language that relates to a specific project, but there is language that relates to the entire element. And at this point in time, we're looking at a fairly small subset of the original roadway element that we're going to be looking at beginning to make adjustments.
But no set percentage?
There was a 10% of the total plan.
Okay, that's what I recall.
And
Thank you.
that kind of goes back and applies to the mandate on the legislation that we could not make any changes beyond that 10%. And that was just one way of measuring change.
What percentage of the element would these increases account for?
I don't know offhand, but just taking a look at that 10% rule, we looked at it against the original ballot amount, it's basically $2 billion worth of projects. We inflate that, and probably 25. The GDP alone has gone up 25% since 2006. We look at that and we look at the 10%. We have a lot of latitude.
Just going back to Strassman's comment of, if you allow a percentage here, future projects down the road, would they be capped out of that 10% at some point in an element with an increase? Now, I understand you get the $2 billion for the whole picture, but would there be an element that could run out of money and potential increases because of inflation or whatever in that area? So just something to think about.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a valid approach to looking at what's the capacity for change, and then make sure any recommendations that move forward are within that capacity.
And the future potential too with remaining projects.
I just feel like at bare minimum, anything that you're asking any of us to do, there has to be some way to demonstrate that it's beyond a shadow of doubt consistent with the voter approved plan, and that anything that exceeds the voter approved limitations needs to have some sort of documented justification so that we're not establishing a new end run around the voter approved plans in the future.
And taking into consideration that the dollars in that plan
Yeah.
were 2006.
That's definitely
I mean, we shouldn't be punished for inflation and stuff like that. I mean, things happen, but
Yeah,
holy
exactly.
smokes, nobody knew what 2 years ago was gonna be like, so.
yeah.
And with projects like Downtown Links and Broadway Boulevard, I can't imagine what the underground was like.
So again, a point well taken, and as you recall, following the Great Recession, we did enjoy some of that cost reduction, but now we're in a different environment, and now we have cost increases to deal with. So,
And it could be worse next year. I mean, it could be.
Yes.
Not having enough workers. I mean, workers shortages too.
Material shortage.
No, again, thank you. Great comments. So our hope is that we'll continue to answer those questions, get the additional documents and the information so we can make an informed decision and make a recommendation to the board. And very helpful comments. We appreciate that.
Madam Chair, that concludes our agenda. And if there's a direction that you wish to articulate in the form of a motion, that might be helpful.
Does anyone want to motion for the recommendation?
I keep
with
asking,
these.
what do you guys need? Because I think we have some direction, but do you need a formal?
I think it would be helpful to document for the same purpose that you brought up, to document that if we find ourselves in the same position again, that there needs to be documentation and a criteria to identify additional cost within the cap. So I think that's, you've all said it in different ways, but I think we understand it. If you put it in a form of a motion, I think that would be helpful for our future conversations as well.
So does this motion go forth to the full CART committee? Is that what
Well,
this motion is?
at this time, it's really at this level, we really want to make sure that we have an understanding on how you want to address these projects. So that's up to you if you want to explore it any more in depth. But the recommendation is ultimately to the board to make sure that they have the information they need to make that decision.
So I will make a motion then that with these 4 specific projects, is that clear enough? We don't need to outline that. So with these 4 specific projects, I would like the board to ensure that they are within the scope of the voter approved RTA plan and to demonstrate a justification for the need to exceed the expenditures outlined in the voter approved RTA plan. Is that covering what we want?
Yes, if you
I
all
think
agree.
so.
And again, obviously the additional information is really helpful for us to kind of make sure that it's within the cap that's authorized for additional expenditures. So I think we captured that as part of the conversation.
Well, I don't want to make it more complicated, but just since we're breaking new ground, I would also suggest that we include in that any future projects down the road where we have these same issues come up are analyzed under these same standards, that they're
Yes.
within the scope and that there's a justification for the need to exceed, so that we're just laying down the tracks for when this happens again.
Well, thank you. That's good.
There a second?
I will second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Well, Madam Chair, that concludes our agenda. And
Thank you. Again, if you believe you'd like us to give an update to the full CART, we'll be happy to give a full update of this conversation to the full CART committee as well. It will be just for information at that point.
Right.
That would be great, yes. Right, is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you all.
Madam Chair.
It's good to see everybody again.
I know.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Well, at
About a
least
year and
some
a half?
people, half the CART committee.
You're working really good. Good to see you. Appreciate it.